Greetings! Hegel and the West, third video in the series, and we're still on the section of spirit. So this is the last video in the subsection on Hegel and forgiveness. And last time we looked at Hegel and Hollywood Western films. And we looked at how the simple morality of the classic Westerns, you know, good guys versus baddies, that's how America tried to understand its past. Westerns were about founding institutions of law in a lawless environment. And Westerns include indigenous Americans as part of the lawless environment too. And they're a fable about how institutions like the rule of law, family, market, and church encounter and overcome the obstacles presented by nature and natural instinct. And so they resemble a biblical origin story, the eradication of the norms of traditional society by imposing external laws upon this state of nature or the state of original sin. This is what Abraham did when he was prepared to sacrifice Isaac. And why did he want to do something that was contrary to his natural instinct? Kill your own child. Again, that was to obey God's laws. And describing traditional societies of North America is like describing Abraham wanting to kill Isaac. So this founding moment of Western civilization, it echoes down the ages, even into, the Abraham story. It echoes into the colonization of North America. So that's how white America understood its founding myths. So it's bringing law into the so-called wilderness. But what about Native America? What is the Hegelian account of colonialism? Does Hegel's account of freedom and self-determination run counter to his own views on colonization? So in the philosophy of right, Hegel says, freedom constitutes the substance and essential character of the will, and the system of right is the kingdom of actualized freedom. So, I mean, that's something we all agree with, isn't it, really? But the bad news is that in the philosophy of world history, Hegel indicates that colonialism is defensible because it spreads the spirit of freedom. And that is quite a claim for us 21st century modern people to accept. For Hegel, freedom was a result of a long historical process. So we'd barely seen the emergence and the possibility of free societies in early 19th century Europe. And Hegel was a witness to the emergence of these societies. He was reading Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, and he was observing the appearance of capitalist civil society. And Europe was just emerging from the darkness of absolutism. So Germany was the most literate country in the world. Maybe 70% of men could read, and this was what Hegel's vantage point was. Global literacy rates at the time, by the way, were about 12% in 1820. By 1920, it was only 20% of the global population. So can we even imagine freedom in the modern sense of people having individual projects, to study at university, to travel the world on a gap year? I mean, that's a bit exaggerated, but even modestly joining a rambling society and to stop for a coffee halfway around or join a political party. Could we imagine that without massive levels of literacy and industrial development? So this is Hegel's point. He's not glorifying imperialism. When civilizations emerge of the Western type with their inbuilt tendencies to expand, it follows you're going to have globalization. So there are terrible downsides to this, but there are advantages. This is the Hegelian point of view. And it doesn't mean that Hegel wasn't prejudiced. Of course he was. But the point is about the logic of his ideas. So before we can even have the idea of colonialism, before that word can be invented, before we can criticize colonialism, before we can understand its meaning, before we can build museums, before we can have textbooks that analyze colonialism for its evils, societies of a certain type have to be created. Under no other society I can think of would it be possible for children's textbooks to be produced that explain the injustices of European expansion. The great irony of history is that this expansion was a precondition of freedom. So expansion was terrible, but without it, we don't have freedom. Freedom isn't a universal property. It's not a transhistorical moral value. It's only been around for the blink of an historical eye, and there are plenty of people who want to see the end of it. Hegel argued that history moved not just temporally, but also geographically from east to west. And he argued that liberal 19th century Christian European societies had broken through the ceiling of unfreedom, or had begun to do so. So remember that most people in Europe didn't even have the remotest possibility of voting when he wrote. So then, that's the historical backdrop. And according to Hegel, outside of Europe, people did not have an adequate understanding of freedom and could only acquire it by means of European imposition. So, was freedom possible outside Europe? I mean, I don't know, but I very much doubt it. And I doubt it could have emerged as rapidly, if at all, without Europe. Sorry, I think of flies all over myself here. Sorry. So Marx's explanatory framework also aligns with Hegel. European colonization denied freedom to the colonized. There's no question about that. But Hegel, rightly or wrongly, saw this denial as legitimate because it laid the basis for colonized freedom to colonize people to gain their freedom in the longer term. So Hegel, he approved of the struggle of independence in Haiti in the philosophy of mind. He said that Haiti was a Christian state. Toussaint Louverture declared Catholicism to be Haiti's official religion. In 1801, basically, his view was that once a people had been colonized sufficiently to acquire European culture, as in Haiti, then those people can acquire freedom. So he wasn't, it's not a racial theory, he just said once you reach a certain level, there's a certain conception of society and of freedom, then, you're off and running. Hegel, therefore, is seen by some as a defender of early colonialism and Eurocentrism, and as I said, there are good reasons to agree with that proposition, but you can't argue that he would agree to modern forms of colonialism, because today most people in the world have the capacity to be free or partially free, unless they live in a dictatorship. And even then they strive to be free because they can see what freedom means. They can see other examples of it in the world. Although we are digressing from Hegel's phenomenology, we're still talking about forgiveness in this section of Spirit. And at the end, hopefully you'll see the point of this detour. And we also need to say that even when Hegel is arguing for colonialism, it's always couched in radical and apparently contradictory terms. So in the Philosophy of World History, 22, he says, Eastern nations knew that one is free. The Greeks and Romans knew that some are free, whilst we know all men are free, and women consequently. Paragraph 23, the final cause of the world we allege to be Spirit's consciousness of its own freedom. So for Hegel, everyone, irrespective of the society, of the historical period they were born into, it doesn't matter what year, what time, but there was this innate capacity for self-determination, because humans are intrinsically but unconsciously geared towards seeking freedom. Irrespective of the historical period, that's a natural urge. The problem is that we aren't aware of this, and it only comes into existence under certain specific historical conditions. And if we're not aware of this capacity to be free, then we remain unfree. So Hegel wrote in The Philosophy of History, 1831, he describes the first historical epoch as Oriental despotism, and this refers to ancient China and India. And at this stage, people had no consciousness of freedom because law and morality were imposed from above, and only the rulers were free. So according to Hegel's scheme, next came Persia, a theocracy, where we see the beginning of a slightly wider conception of freedom. He says, the Persian unity is not that abstract one of the Chinese Empire. It is adapted to rule over many and various nationalities, which it unites under the mild power of universality as a beneficial sun shining over all. Then we have a breakthrough with classical Greek democracy, in which the institution of democracy allows for the freedom of some. But Greek society is based on slavery and denies freedom to non-male Greek citizens. Nevertheless, the limited Greek idea of freedom continued, progressed into Roman society, and that broke up the world of the Greek city-states. And Rome was an even more intense form of slavehold society than Greece was. But it was in Rome that we see the development of the institution of the legal person, which we've looked at earlier. Incidentally, we're still technically unfree because slavery continues. Maybe 40 million people exist as slaves. But let's look at the concepts first. Let's look at what Hegel was getting at. The concept of the legal person emerges in a slave empire. So, of course, it was an undeveloped notion. Roman law was in many ways unsystematic, and it had to be because it had to exclude slaves, so it couldn't be universal. But the origin of the division between the person and the thing, it lies here. In Rome, only those who own things could fully hold the title of person. Rome created a border between persons and things, which makes the person the master of the thing. So a thing is a non-person. A person is a non-thing, and an entity capable of owning things. Gaius, who lived around 160 AD, Rome, BC I should say, so he invented this system or this concept of private law, which divided everything into personae, persons, res, things, and actiones, legal actions. So let's look at the etymology of the word persona. In Latin, it was originally meant masks worn by actors and their characters. So we can see it's an interesting concept, person. The meaning of the word was extended to the roles or qualities of human beings. Cicero talked about 4 personae in every human being: rationality, personal attributes, status, and profession. The Roman idea of personhood was therefore a more complex understanding than the straightforward person equals human that we sort of take for granted today. And a Roman person might therefore be more or less than a singular entity. And this concept influenced Christian theology. As I've covered in other videos, discussion and disagreements about the nature of Christ culminated in the Council of Alexandria in 362, and that came up with the formula that God exists in 3 persons, not one. So the Romans, as late as the Emperor Justinian, did not have the abstract notion of subjective rights, but they did invent the idea of a corporation, an organization that could own property in its own name and which had this fictitious aspect of personhood, which we still have today. So you can be a person without being a human. And there's a famous Mitt Romney quote where he says, "Corporations are people, my friend, corporations are people." And so he's technically correct, even though it's a crazy idea. And so, as I mentioned in a previous video, Justinian's legal works were rediscovered and reanimated in Bologna in the 12th century, perhaps earlier. And from then onwards, law was studied in European universities in its own right. So we can see further moves towards subjective rights in the works of medieval scholars such as William of Ockham, who was a legal scholar as well as a theologian. And the idea of legal personhood and subjective rights, rights that are the property of the individual, emerged over a long period. And we shouldn't think of a eureka moment. Contradictory ideas fight it out, and bad ideas are forever vanquished, by the way. So although Rome began to lay the foundations of legal personhood, however inadequately, it failed to create a universally free society, and the emptiness and boredom of Rome created an intellectual reaction in negative, skeptical philosophies such as Stoicism and skepticism. And these philosophies tried to live in a world that was riddled with contradictions between slavery and freedom. And it did this by trying to make the mind free of the body. And Christianity takes this a step further, and it's significant, and it's a decisive step in humanity's consciousness of freedom. So Catholicism taught that we were made in the image of God and we possessed infinite worth. And Hegel describes this as religious self-consciousness, that the world is ultimately spiritual and not material. But the institution of the Catholic Church, of course, became corrupt and bloated. It became a hierarchy, and because it's part of the real world, it couldn't escape the fact that it was part, and that human foibles intruded into the church. And it subverted this religious spirit. And a millennia passed before we have the Reformation and Luther, who demanded that we need neither priest nor ceremony, nor sacraments, nor church to develop a relationship with God. This leads to the rise of individual conscience, which determines truth and reason. And we have no reason under Luther to even confess our sins to a priest. The Council of Trent in 1543, and that was kind of driven by the Protestant Reformation. It went so far to defend the sacrament of confession from those who called it, so some called confession, the slaughter bench of conscience. The Council of Trent was trying to defend that. And maybe that's where Hegel got his slaughter bench of history from the Council of Trent. The slaughter bench of history. So the introduction of modern meaning of individual conscience is important. And we've got, at this point, the basis of the Enlightenment, because human reason beats blind superstition and being told what to think by a priesthood or an institution. And one consequence of the Enlightenment is the French Revolution. But the Revolution, again, turns to terror. This is the history of humanity in like 5 sentences. So the Revolution turns to terror because it literally puts reason on a pedestal. It literally did have a pedestal with reason on it. So that's the word of the meaning, literally. Hegel calls this abstract reason. And we see in the person of Robespierre the cult of the supreme being, which separates reason from community. And the revolution fails, falls into terror. But despite this, it doesn't disappear completely. It left behind the important principles of reason. And Napoleon brought this with him to Hegel's hometown of Jena at the point of a gun and on horseback. And finally, we've got Hegel's idea of a constitutional monarchy as the highest form of ethical society in which freedom can be realised. Okay, we wouldn't accept that today probably, but that was for his time. So this brings us to the issue of colonialism and its historical justification in Hegel. So what about the Native Americans? This demands for reparations and restitution for transgenerational harm, robbery and injustice are high up on the political agenda today. And the word colonialism was first used around the time Hegel was writing. In fact, in 1791, the word colonialism was coined by Jeremy Bentham in a letter to Lord Pelham. So there was no awareness or definition of what colonialism was before this point. So yeah, people fought invaders and people had done that for thousands of years, but the self-awareness of the concept of colonialism wasn't present until Bentham. And the self-awareness of the slave is key, therefore, to freedom for Hegel. Hegel argues that slaves or serfs living in a slave society have the right to be free, but don't have or didn't have the ability before the Enlightenment to exercise or understand what freedom is, because their entire world was one of subjugation. And freedom isn't a natural idea, which brings us back to the idea in, I think it was the first bit about, let me have a look. Yeah, in the previous video where we said that the United Nations Article 1 says that people are born free as though it's a natural thing. Well, it's not true. That's completely false. So it's not a natural idea. It's a social idea, just like slavery is a social idea. Because freedom is social, it's bound up with social practices and institutions that develop over a great length of time in very specific historical contexts. If those institutions and practices are absent, then so is any meaningful idea of freedom. So freedom is therefore something that emerges over time, and it's embedded within an institutional and a social practice. If we take, for example, the Spartacus Rebellion, or there's an even better example, the Second Servile War in Sicily. That was a slave rebellion, both of them, under the Romans. So when the slaves were successful in overthrowing the order of the masters in Sicily, they did not institute a free society. And actually Spartacus wanted to just carry on marching out. He wanted to become a new emperor. He could have left, but he wanted to reinstitute slavery. They just wanted the Romans to be slaves. But anyway, in Sicily, the Second Servile War, they just reinstituted slavery. And the leader of the Sicilian slave rebellion, whose name was Salvius, he had himself crowned king, and he wore the purple robes of a Roman dictator. Consciousness of freedom, therefore, is social and develops over time. And when a slave kills a master or runs away from a slave owner, it doesn't make the slave free. The self-awareness of those liberating themselves is the key thing here. Freedom isn't just freedom from tyranny. It requires a positive social content, and only certain types of societies at a certain historical juncture seem to be able to develop this positive content. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 differed from all of the slave revolutions because it copied the French Revolution. It was the only slave uprising in human history that's led to the creation of a state which was free from slavery and ruled by non-whites and former slaves. So in a sense, what Hegel is saying about that is he's putting the Haitian Revolution on a huge pedestal. He's saying how amazing that is. So freedom eventually makes the leap from religious domain to the secular, and understanding why Europe had an economic advantage over the rest of the world by the 18th century, that's something that's preoccupied anthropologists, economic historians, social historians, cultural historians. Why did the Europeans have an advantage over authentic Americans, for example? So in the 1990s, there's a guy called Jared Diamond, and he published a book called Guns, Germs and Steel that dominated popular understanding for a long time. And he argued for a form of environmental determinism. So European supremacy was, for Diamond, a consequence of environmental or geographic differences on human cultures. Hegel's explanation is Eurocentric, but much more convincing, because it's saying it's like a cultural to social thing. It's about slavery. It's geography. There's lots of other things that are thrown into the mix. And this brings us back to Hollywood and forgiveness. Hollywood Westerns downplayed the Native American because the focus of the Hollywood film was on building and explaining the emergence of European civilization in North America. So the Hegelian concept of forgiveness means that we can understand why that type of morality was the morality of old America. Now we're past that now. But so it doesn't mean you've got to love the Westerns, you've got to see them in their context. One final point, it's an ironical aside. The black and white morality of the American Western reminds us that the cattle barons and the gangsters who thrive on lawlessness have never really gone away. The struggle for law amongst the lawless oligarchs of the 21st century, that's the morality of our era. So the cattle barons of the Hollywood films, these are the Elon Musks of the 21st century. Okay, thank you. And next time we'll move on to religion, Hegel and religion.